It was the early hours of a Saturday morning. 11 days had passed since the Allied landings in Normandy, and the situation was only getting worse by the hour. Rommel arrived at his headquarters in La Roche-Guyon, utterly exhausted. He hadn't slept in days, harassed by bombings, casualty reports, and the certainty that the war in the West was lost. But then, news froze him in his tracks. Hitler was flying to the front. He was going to meet him in just 6 hours. In this meeting, the Desert Fox would have to tell the Führer what no one else dared to. Germany could not win the Battle of Normandy. What happened in that secret meeting? Why did Hitler storm out in fury, never to set foot in France again? Well, that is exactly what we are going to uncover next. At 3 a.m. on June 17, 1944, Rommel reached his headquarters. He wanted nothing more than to sleep. But his chief of staff, Hans Speidel, had a surprise for him. Hitler had summoned them to an urgent meeting, 240 kilometers away. In just 6 hours, the Führer himself, who rarely ever set foot at the front, was flying to meet him and von Rundstedt. Rommel barely rested. By 3:30 a.m., he was already on the road, driving through France in the dead of night. Luckily, Allied fighter bombers were not active during those hours of darkness. Hitler had decided to fly west on impulse. Days earlier, Rommel had challenged him, urging that he come to France to see the situation with his own eyes. Rommel surely expected one of Hitler's advisors to come instead, but no one imagined the Führer himself would appear in person. His aerial convoy, led by a specially fitted Focke-Wulf 200 Condor carrying Hitler, accompanied by 3 other FW-200S with his entourage, landed in Metz shortly after midnight. By 8 in the morning, he reached his destination, the Margeval complex near Soissons, a fortified underground installation never before used by Hitler. It was located just 90 kilometers from Paris and about 250 kilometers from the Normandy front lines. Rommel and von Rundstedt arrived just in time. SS guards searched them and immediately led them inside the complex. There, in a stark room decorated only with a fireplace and a bas-relief of Napoleon, Hitler awaited them, sitting on a plain stool, pale, silent, and furious. The meeting was tense from the very first moment. Hitler scolded them for failing to stop the Allied invasion. 11 days had passed since the landings, and the situation was growing worse by the minute. He insisted that Cherbourg Fortress must be held at all costs. But Rundstedt was blunt. It was impossible. The Allies had complete superiority in the air and at sea. At that very moment, American forces were about to cut off the Cotentin Peninsula, isolating 4 German divisions near Cherbourg. Controlling Cherbourg was crucial, as the Germans hoped to prevent the Allies from capturing it and unloading supplies into Normandy at a much faster pace. Rommel, weary and increasingly irritated, was even more direct than Rundstedt. He spoke of the war of attrition he had long foreseen, of demoralized troops, of the constant bombardments, and of how fixed defenses were useless against the overwhelming firepower of Allied naval guns. Against such an enemy, Rommel stated, fighting was practically impossible. He added that it wasn't true that German troops had been caught by surprise. In fact, their actions in the first hours of the invasion had been nothing short of superhuman. Yet supply lines were constantly bombed, Allied fighter bombers ruled the skies, and naval artillery alone could shatter any German counterattack. Montgomery, Rommel noted, was repeating the very tactics he had used in North Africa, slowly and methodically grinding down German forces through massive air and naval bombardments, followed by well-supported infantry assaults. Then Rommel issued a chilling warning. "Cherbourg will fall within a week," he declared. Hitler remained silent, so Rommel pressed on. The frontline troops, he explained, were shell-shocked by relentless bombing, demoralized by Allied firepower, and overwhelmed by the enemy's evident logistical superiority. Sooner or later, Rommel concluded, the front would collapse. This was due to the fact that the Allies were landing between 2 and 3 divisions per week, far outnumbering the sporadic German reinforcements arriving in Normandy. Thus, sooner or later, the outcome was obvious. But Hitler disagreed. He insisted that Cherbourg had to hold. Ignoring the matter of Cherbourg, Rommel argued that the best strategy would be to withdraw inland and counterattack in a sector beyond the range of the naval guns. But for that, he needed freedom of action, more tanks, and air support. Moreover, he needed to act with independence, without having to request permission or consult the OKW at every step. Although Hitler became somewhat more conciliatory as the morning went on, he rejected Rommel's key requests. He refused to use the V-1 rockets against the invasion beaches, and he also refused to move General von Salmuth's 15th Army toward Normandy, still fearing a second landing at the Pas de Calais. Rommel, increasingly frustrated, pointed out that Hitler's information came only from officers who studied maps on a table. "They don't know the front," he told him. "They demand our trust, but they do not trust us." He reminded Hitler that Churchill had already visited his troops at the front, which had given them a huge morale boost. He even suggested Hitler do the same. To everyone's surprise, the Führer agreed and said he would visit Normandy. But then the meeting was suddenly interrupted. An Allied bomber formation was approaching the area. At once, they had to rush into the air raid shelter inside the Margval complex. Once inside, as they waited for the danger to pass, the conversation turned more informal. Rommel spoke more openly about Germany's desperate situation on every front and about the impossibility of resisting indefinitely. He hinted that the war was lost and that it would be better to negotiate peace. Naturally, Hitler hated hearing such words. This was the last thing he wanted to be told. Still, he admitted that negotiations were impossible. First, because he himself did not want them, and second, because even if he did, the Allies had already decided on Germany's destruction and subjugation. A conditional surrender, he said, would never be accepted. Finally, Hitler concluded, "Now everything depends on fanatical resistance on all fronts." He told Rommel not to worry about political matters. Focus only on stopping the invasion. Those were the last words he addressed to Rommel before their farewell. Despite everything, Rommel left that afternoon with a small glimmer of hope, encouraged by the possibility of Hitler visiting Normandy and by his enthusiasm for the new wonder weapons, the Me-262 jet fighter, the V-1 rockets, and other technological projects. During the meeting, Hitler had even shown him the damage the V-1s were inflicting on London, believing that these attacks could eventually break British resistance. Von Rundstedt, however, considered the conference a complete waste of time. And he was right. Rommel would not receive full authority. The Me-262 would never reach Normandy in time. And the revolutionary V-2 rockets, which Hitler also mentioned, would not appear until long after the campaign was over. Supplies would continue arriving too slowly and in insufficient quantities. The troops would remain overstretched, edging closer and closer to collapse. Hitler, for his part, never made his visit to Normandy. That very same afternoon, a stray V-1 veered off course and exploded just a few kilometers from his headquarters, where Rommel and Rundstedt had only just departed. Shaken by the near miss, General Jodl advised him to return to Bavaria. What if another stray V-1 killed the Führer? Added to that were reports of French resistance activity in the area. Suddenly, the trip to the front seemed far too risky. Hitler canceled his visit and returned to the Berghof. He would never again set foot on French soil. So then, what do you think about this meeting? In the description, you'll find the documentary we filmed in Normandy with Antonio Munoz, where you'll discover all the hidden details of this battle. And as always, I'll see you next Sunday. Until then, farewell.